If dignity had a sound, it would be silence. Someone whispered as the laughter spread across the auditorium, low at first, then louder, sharper, echoing off the polished wooden walls like it belonged there, like it had permission, and right in the middle of it stood Ethan Walker, a janitor in a faded blue shirt, his name stitched unevenly above his chest, his work boots still dusted with the quiet evidence of a long day, while beside him, his daughter Sophie clutched the edge of her oversized sweater, her small fingers trembling just enough to betray what she refused to say out loud. "You sure about this?" a teacher muttered under her breath, not unkind, just uncertain, and another parent leaned in with a smirk. This is going to be hard to watch, but Ethan didn't answer them. He didn't argue, didn't defend, he just lowered himself slowly to one knee, so he was eye level with Sophie. The fluorescent lights above casting a soft halo that made the moment feel smaller, more intimate than the room deserved. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice steady like something that had weathered storms before. "You don't need them to understand you." Sophie's eyes flickered, searching his face for something stronger than fear. "Just sing the way you do at home," he added, a faint smile touching the corners of his lips, the kind that didn't demand attention but earned it. She nodded, barely, but it was enough. Enough for him to stand again, enough for her to take that one step forward onto the stage where the spotlight hit too bright, and the silence that followed the laughter felt heavier than before, like the room itself was holding its breath. "Name?" someone called from the side, clipboard in hand. "Sophie Walker," she answered, her voice soft but clear, and a few scattered chuckles slipped through again, someone whispering, "Walker? Isn't that the janitor's kid?" But then came the pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to test courage, just long enough to make people wonder if she would turn back, and for a split second, it looked like she might, her shoulders tightening, her breath catching, until Ethan shifted slightly in the crowd, not stepping forward, not calling out, just standing there, steady, present, a quiet anchor in a room full of noise. And somehow that was enough, because Sophie closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, and began, the first note fragile, almost lost in the vastness of the auditorium. But then the second came, steadier, and the third carried something deeper, something honest, something that didn't ask for approval, and one by one, the whispers stopped, the smirks faded, phones lowered, and even the air seemed to change, thickening into something no one could quite explain. And in the very back row, where the light barely reached, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit leaned forward just slightly, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed not on the stage, but on Ethan, because unlike everyone else, she wasn't surprised by the silence that was coming. She had seen it before, in a moment no one here knew about. A moment where this same quiet man had chosen kindness when no one was watching, and as Sophie's voice rose just enough to fill the room without forcing it, the last trace of laughter disappeared completely, leaving behind something rare, something unspoken, something that made even the proudest among them sit still and listen, because in that moment, it was no longer about a performance. It was about truth, and truth, when it finally speaks, doesn't need to be loud to be heard. The last note lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Not loud, not forced, just present. And when Sophie finally opened her eyes, she did not look at the crowd. She looked for her father, and Ethan was already watching, not clapping yet, not moving, just holding that same quiet steadiness like he always did. And then slowly, almost carefully, he brought his hands together, one soft clap that echoed more than the applause that followed, because it was not about volume, it was about meaning, and the room seemed to understand that, rising into a standing ovation that felt less like excitement and more like respect rediscovered. That was unexpected. One parent murmured, shifting uncomfortably as if something inside them had been quietly corrected, while the teacher who had doubted earlier wiped the corner of her eye and whispered, "She has something real." But Ethan did not turn to them, did not claim anything. He simply waited as Sophie stepped down from the stage, her steps lighter now, her shoulders no longer carrying the weight they had walked in with. "You did it," he said softly when she reached him, kneeling again despite the crowd pressing closer, despite the noise growing around them. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a breath. "I know," he replied, a faint smile returning, But you sang anyway. And that was enough. It had always been enough for him. Because courage, in his world, was never about being the loudest person in the room. It was about showing up when it would be easier not to, and somewhere behind them. The woman in the charcoal suit stood still, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her eyes never leaving Ethan, as if she were piecing together something long unresolved. "Sir," a voice called out, pulling Ethan back to the present. A school coordinator approaching with a clipboard and a tone that had shifted from polite dismissal to careful curiosity. "We would like to talk to you about Sophie's performance. There might be opportunities." Ethan nodded once, not eager, not dismissive, just measured. "She would like that," he said, glancing down at Sophie, who held his hand a little tighter now. But then the coordinator hesitated, glancing briefly toward the back of the room, toward the woman who had not yet moved. "Actually, someone else has already expressed interest," she added, lowering her voice slightly. And for the first time, Ethan followed her gaze, his eyes landing on the woman who now began to walk forward, her steps unhurried, deliberate, the soft click of her heels cutting through the fading applause. And as she approached, there was no smile of politeness, no display of authority, only a calm recognition that felt strangely personal. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice even, carrying just enough warmth to feel intentional, and Ethan paused, not surprised exactly, but not entirely unaware either, because something in her tone did not belong to this room. "Have we met?" he asked quietly, and for a brief moment, the noise around them seemed to fall away again, leaving only that question suspended between them, and the woman's expression softened just enough to reveal something deeper beneath the composure, something that hinted at a story not yet told. "Not here," she replied gently, her eyes holding his with a quiet certainty. "But you helped me once, when you had no reason to." And in that single sentence, something shifted again, not in the room this time, but in Ethan himself, like a memory brushing against the surface, almost within reach, yet not fully formed. And Sophie looked up at her father, sensing the change without understanding it, while the woman continued, her voice steady. "I have been looking for you ever since." And the silence that followed was different now, not heavy, not tense, but full, like the beginning of something that had been waiting patiently for its moment to be seen. The words lingered longer than the applause had, quiet but undeniable, and Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not hear her, but because something in his memory stirred just enough to make him pause. "I help a lot of people," he said finally, his tone calm, not dismissive, just honest, and the woman nodded as if she expected that. "I know," she replied, her gaze softening. "That is why you did not recognize me." Sophie looked between them, her small hand still wrapped around her father's, sensing that this moment mattered even if she could not yet understand why, and the crowd around them began to thin, voices lowering, attention drifting elsewhere, but a few remained, watching, curious now instead of amused, because something about this quiet exchange felt important. "It was raining," the woman continued gently. "Late, near the old highway diner just outside town." Ethan's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in focus, as if he were reaching for a memory just beyond his grasp. "My car would not start," she added, "and my phone was dead." And then it came, not all at once, but enough for him to see it again, the dim glow of a flickering sign, the sound of rain hitting pavement, the way he had been finishing a long shift and just wanted to go home, and yet he had stopped. "You were there," she said, her voice steady, "and you stayed." Ethan exhaled slowly, the memory settling into place now. "That was nothing," he said quietly, almost instinctively, because to him, it had been just a moment, just a choice, just something decent. But the woman shook her head, a small, firm motion that carried more weight than any argument. "It was not nothing," she said, and for a second, the air between them felt different again, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded, like truth finding its place. "You fixed what you could. You gave me your last bottle of water, and when I offered to pay you, you refused." Ethan glanced away briefly, uncomfortable with the attention, not out of modesty, but because he had never measured his actions that way. "You said I would do the same for someone else one day," she continued, her voice softer now. And then you left before I could even ask your name." Sophie's eyes widened slightly as she looked up at her father, a quiet pride forming in her expression, something small but powerful, and Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, a subtle gesture of humility. "Like I said," he murmured. "It was nothing." But the woman stepped closer, not invading, just closing the distance enough for her words to land with clarity. "It was everything that night," she said, and this time, Ethan did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because something in her tone told him this was not about the past anymore. It was about what came next and around them. The last of the onlookers drifted away, leaving only a few quiet glances and the soft hum of the auditorium settling back into stillness. "My name is Claire Bennett," she added after a moment, extending her hand, not as a formality, but as a connection finally completed, and Ethan looked at it, then at her, and something in his expression shifted just slightly. Not recognition of her name yet, but recognition of intent, and as he reached out to shake her hand, the silence returned once more, not heavy, not uncertain, but filled with the quiet sense that the story unfolding in front of them had only just begun. Her hand was steady when Ethan took it, not firm in a way that demanded attention, but certain, like someone who had learned the value of quiet decisions, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment itself carried enough weight. "Claire Bennett," Ethan repeated softly, as if testing the name against something unspoken, and Sophie shifted slightly beside him, her curiosity no longer hidden. "Are you someone important?" she asked, her voice innocent, unfiltered in the way only a child could be, and Claire's expression softened immediately, a small smile breaking through the composed exterior she had carried into the room. "Not more important than your father," she replied gently, kneeling just enough to meet Sophie at eye level, and that answer, simple as it was, seemed to settle something in the air, like truth spoken without decoration, while Ethan watched quietly, his eyes studying her not for status, but for sincerity, and for the first time, he began to sense that this was not coincidence. This was something that had been moving toward him long before tonight. "I run a foundation," Claire continued, standing again, her tone returning to calm clarity. "We support young artists, children who have talent, but not always the opportunity." Ethan nodded once, not impressed, not dismissive, just listening, the way he always did, fully, without interruption. "I have been traveling, visiting schools, listening, watching," she added, her gaze briefly shifting toward the stage where Sophie had stood just minutes ago. But tonight was different, and the way she said it made it clear that she did not mean the performance alone. She meant everything around it. The laughter, the doubt, the quiet strength that had not responded to either. "You saw her," Sophie said softly, almost to herself, and Claire nodded. "I saw both of you," she replied, and there it was again. That quiet recognition that did not exaggerate, did not dramatize, but landed deeper than praise ever could, because it was not about talent alone. It was about character, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly, as if he had been carrying something invisible that no one had ever acknowledged before. "What are you asking?" he said after a moment, direct, not defensive, just clear, and Claire appreciated that. It showed in the way her expression sharpened with respect rather than persuasion. "I would like to invite Sophie to a private program," she answered. "Mentorship, training, real opportunities, no pressure, just a chance." Sophie's grip on Ethan's hand tightened again, not from fear this time, but from something closer to hope, fragile, careful, like something she did not want to break by believing in too quickly, and Ethan looked down at her, then back at Claire, his silence stretching just long enough to remind everyone that he did not make decisions lightly, not when it came to his daughter, not when it came to anything that mattered. "And what do you want in return?" he asked, his voice even, because in his world, offers always came with expectations, even the kind ones. And Claire shook her head, a faint breath escaping as if she had anticipated that question. "Nothing you would not choose freely," she said, her tone steady. "I am not here to take, Mr. Walker. I am here because years ago, you gave without asking." And the simplicity of that statement did something the applause could not. It shifted the balance of the moment entirely, because suddenly, this was no longer about opportunity being handed down. It was about something being returned, something that had been waiting for its moment to find its way back, and Ethan stood there, quiet, grounded, his daughter's hand in his, a woman in front of him offering a future neither of them had planned for. And for the first time that night, the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was full of possibility, the kind that does not rush, the kind that waits for the right answer to be spoken. The room had emptied, but the weight of the moment had not. It followed them quietly as Ethan and Sophie stepped out into the cool night air, the faint hum of streetlights, replacing the distant echo of applause. And for a while, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because some moments needed space before they could be understood. "Dad," Sophie finally said, her voice soft, careful, as if she were afraid the wrong words might break something fragile. "Was that real?" Ethan glanced down at her, his expression calm but thoughtful, the kind of look that came from a man who had learned to measure truth slowly. "It was real," he answered, but there was no excitement in his tone, only grounding, only steadiness, and Sophie nodded, absorbing that, holding it close like something she was not ready to celebrate yet, just ready to believe. "Do you think I should do it?" she asked after a few more steps, her small sneakers scuffing lightly against the sidewalk, and Ethan did not answer right away. He stopped, turned toward her fully, and crouched down again, bringing himself to her level the way he always did when something mattered. "What do you think?" he asked instead, and Sophie hesitated, her eyes searching his. "I liked singing," she admitted, "but I do not want people to laugh again." And there it was, not fear of failure, but fear of being seen the wrong way, and Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that better than anyone, people will always decide what they see, he said quietly. "But that does not mean they get to decide who you are." Sophie looked at him for a long second, the words settling deeper than she could explain, and then she gave a small nod, not certain, but stronger than before, and they kept walking, their apartment just a few blocks away, a small place above an old grocery store that smelled faintly of coffee and worn wood, the kind of place that held more memories than space. And when they stepped inside, nothing had changed. The same dim lamp in the corner, the same secondhand couch, the same quiet that had become their normal. But something inside it felt different now. Not bigger, not brighter, just possible. Sophie dropped her bag gently by the door and walked over to the small keyboard sitting against the wall, her fingers hovering above the keys like she was asking permission from something unseen. And Ethan watched from the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, his arms relaxed, his presence steady. "You can try again," he said softly, not as instruction, but as permission, and Sophie pressed one key, then another, the sound simple, imperfect, but hers, and in that small apartment, far from the stage, far from the applause, the music felt more real than anything that had happened earlier, because this was where it began, not in front of people, not under lights, but here, in the quiet, and across town, in a car that idled just a little longer than necessary. Claire Bennett sat in silence, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her thoughts not on the program, not on the logistics, but on Ethan, on the way he had not rushed, had not been impressed, had not tried to prove anything. And she smiled faintly, a recognition settling in her chest, because she understood something now that she had not fully seen before. This was not a man who needed opportunity. This was a man who chose it carefully. And as she finally put the car in drive, her voice barely above a whisper, she said to herself, "This time, I will do it right." And the night carried that promise quietly forward, as if it already knew the silence it would one day return. Morning came quietly, the kind that did not rush but unfolded slowly through thin curtains and soft light. And Ethan was already awake before the alarm, sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that had long gone lukewarm, his eyes not on anything in particular, but carrying the weight of a decision that had followed him through the night. "You did not sleep much," Sophie said from the doorway, her voice still carrying traces of sleep, and Ethan looked up, offering a small smile that did not hide the truth but softened it. "I slept enough," he replied, which in his world meant he had thought more than rested. Sophie walked over, her steps light, and climbed onto the chair across from him, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the worn surface of the table. "Are we going to say yes?" she asked, direct in the way children often are when something matters, and Ethan leaned back, slightly, folding his hands together, not avoiding the question, just honoring it. "We are going to understand first," he said calmly. "Then we decide." And Sophie nodded, absorbing that rhythm, that patience. Because it was how he had always taught her to move through life, not fast, not loud, but with intention. And just then, a soft knock came at the door, unexpected, not urgent, just present, and Ethan stood, his movement steady, crossing the small living room in a few quiet steps before opening it. And there she was, Claire Bennett, not in a formal suit this time, but in something simpler, still composed, still unmistakably intentional. "I hope I am not too early," she said, her tone warm but respectful, as if she understood that timing mattered here, and Ethan stepped aside without hesitation. "You are right on time," he replied, and Sophie peeked from behind him, her eyes widening slightly with recognition. "Good morning, Sophie," Claire said gently, and Sophie gave a small wave, unsure but not afraid, and they all moved into the apartment, the space suddenly feeling smaller but not uncomfortable, just different, like it was being asked to hold something new. "I brought breakfast," Claire added, placing a simple paper bag on the table, the smell of fresh pastries and coffee filling the room in a way that felt both ordinary and unfamiliar, and Ethan glanced at it briefly before meeting her eyes again. "You did not have to do that," he said, not rejecting, just acknowledging, and Claire nodded. "I know," she replied softly, and that answer carried more meaning than explanation, and for a moment, they stood there in a quiet triangle of understanding, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud. "I would like to explain everything," Claire continued after a pause, her voice steady, grounded. "Not to convince you, but so you can choose with clarity." Ethan gestured toward the table. "Then sit," he said simply, and they did. 3 chairs, 1 small table, the morning light stretching across it like a quiet invitation, and Claire began, not with numbers or promises, but with purpose. "This program is not about turning children into something they are not," she said, her eyes moving briefly to Sophie, then back to Ethan. "It is about protecting what is already there." And Ethan listened, not interrupting, not reacting, just present, while Sophie reached slowly for a pastry, glancing at her father for silent permission, which he gave with a nod. And as Claire spoke, the room remained still, no urgency, no pressure, just words placed carefully, like steps on a path that had not yet been chosen. And outside, the city moved on as it always did, unaware that inside this small apartment, something quiet and significant was unfolding, something that did not announce itself, but would one day be remembered as the moment everything began to change. Claire did not rush her words. She let them settle one by one, as if she understood that trust was not built by speed but by clarity. "There are no contracts you cannot walk away from," she said calmly, her hands resting lightly on the table. "No obligations that take her childhood away." Ethan's eyes stayed on her, steady, measuring not just what she said, but how she said it, because he had learned long ago that intention often lived between the lines, not inside them. "And if she fails?" he asked, not harsh, not doubtful, just real, and Claire did not hesitate. "Then she learns," she replied, her voice even. "And we stand with her anyway." Sophie looked up at that, her small expression shifting, not fully understanding the structure of programs or foundations, but understanding something deeper, that she would not be alone, and Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing that answer, letting it settle into the quiet framework he used to make decisions. "You said you have been looking for me," he continued after a moment. "Why?" And Claire exhaled softly, not uncomfortable, but aware that this part mattered more than anything she had said so far. "Because that night changed something for me," she said, her gaze steady now, no longer professional, but personal. "I had built my life on control, on knowing exactly who people were and what they wanted, and then you showed me something different." Ethan did not move, but something in his expression softened just enough to show he was listening deeper now. "You helped me when I had nothing to offer you," she continued, "and you did not even stay to be thanked." Sophie glanced between them, her curiosity growing, while Ethan remained quiet, letting her finish. "After that, I started paying attention," Claire said, "not to power, not to status, but to character." And she paused, just long enough for the words to land fully. That is what I build my foundation on now. The room fell still again, not heavy, not uncertain, just grounded, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. So this is not charity, he said, and Claire shook her head. No, she replied. This is recognition, and that word carried a different weight, one that did not place him below or above, just seen, and Sophie shifted in her seat, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table. If I go, she said softly, almost testing the words, will I still come home? And Claire's expression softened immediately. Always, she answered, without hesitation. This is not about taking you away. It is about helping you grow into who you already are. Ethan looked at Sophie then, really looked at her, not as a child who needed protection, but as a person who was beginning to choose her own path. And for a moment, the room held that quiet tension between holding on and letting go, the kind that every parent recognizes but rarely names. You decide, he said finally, his voice calm, steady, placing the choice where it belonged. And Sophie took a small breath, her eyes moving from her father to Claire and back again, her voice still soft but clearer now. I want to try, she said, and the words did not explode with excitement. They landed gently, but with certainty, and Ethan nodded. Once, a small motion that carried trust, and Claire allowed herself a faint smile, not of victory, but of respect, because she understood that what had just been given was not permission, it was belief. And outside, the morning had fully arrived, light filling the room in a way that felt quiet but undeniable, like something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change everything that would come next. The decision did not change the room all at once. It changed the air inside it, quieter but sharper, like something had been set into motion that could not be easily undone. And Claire stood slowly, not in a rush to finalize anything, but in recognition that this moment deserved space. We will start simple, she said, her voice calm, measured. One visit, one session, no pressure to stay beyond what feels right. Ethan nodded once, appreciating the restraint more than any promise, while Sophie sat a little straighter, her earlier hesitation now shaped into something more focused, not confidence yet, but direction. And as Claire gathered her things, she paused at the door, turning back just slightly. Saturday morning, she added. 10 o'clock, I will pick you up myself. And Ethan met her gaze, not agreeing blindly, but not resisting either. We will be ready, he said. And that was enough. No handshake needed this time. No extra words, just a quiet understanding sealed by presence rather than performance. And when the door closed behind her, the apartment returned to its familiar stillness. But it no longer felt the same. 10 o'clock, Sophie repeated softly, as if saying it out loud made it real, and Ethan gave a small nod, already moving toward the sink to rinse his coffee cup, grounding himself in routine the way he always did when something new entered his life. We still have school today, he said, his tone steady, bringing the moment back to what was normal, what was certain, and Sophie smiled faintly, understanding that this was how he kept things balanced, not by ignoring change, but by not letting it take over everything at once. And the day unfolded like any other. Backpacks, hallway noise, the familiar rhythm of lockers opening and closing. But this time, something was different, not in what people saw, but in how Sophie carried herself, quieter still, but not shrinking, not folding into the background the way she had before. That was you yesterday, a classmate whispered, not mocking, not quite admiring either, just unsure, and Sophie hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, she said simply, and that was all. No explanation, no defense, just truth. And the conversation ended there, not because there was nothing more to say, but because there was nothing to prove. And across town, Claire sat in her office, a space defined not by luxury but by intention, sunlight stretching across clean lines and quiet order, her assistant standing nearby with a tablet in hand. You cleared your entire Saturday schedule, he said, not questioning, just confirming. And Claire nodded without looking up, her attention resting on a file that now held a single name written neatly across the top. Yes, she replied, her voice calm but final. This one matters. And the assistant paused, then added carefully, there are others waiting. and Claire finally looked up, her expression steady. "There are always others waiting," she said, but not all of them were found. And the room fell silent after that. Not awkward, not tense, just resolved. And back in the small apartment above the grocery store, evening settled in with the soft hum of the city winding down. Sophie sat at the keyboard again, her fingers moving more freely now. Not perfect, not practiced, but honest. While Ethan watched from across the room, his presence quiet as ever, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel it. Not the opportunity, not the future, but the simple truth of what had already happened, that his daughter had stood in front of a room that expected her to fail and chose to sing anyway. And in that realization, something inside him shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to know that whatever came next, they would meet it the same way they always had, quietly, together, with a kind of strength that did not need to be seen to be real. Saturday did not arrive with noise or ceremony. It came the way most important days do, quietly, with light filtering through the same thin curtains and the same small kitchen holding the same worn table. But this time, there was something else beneath it all, a sense of movement, of something waiting just beyond reach. And Sophie was already dressed before Ethan finished his coffee, her shoes tied neatly, her hands resting in her lap, as if she were trying to hold still the excitement that kept rising anyway. "You are ready early," Ethan said, his tone soft but observant, and Sophie nodded. "I did not want to be late," she replied, and he smiled faintly, not because of the words, but because of what they revealed, that she cared enough to prepare, enough to show up fully. And at exactly 10 o'clock, there was a gentle knock at the door, not rushed, not loud, just precise, and Ethan opened it to find Claire standing there, composed as always, but this time with something lighter in her expression, something that felt closer to familiarity than formality. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm, and Sophie stepped forward without hesitation. "Good morning," she echoed, her voice steadier than before, and the three of them moved together down the narrow stairwell and out into the street where a dark, understated car waited, not flashy, not demanding attention, just present, like everything else Claire seemed to choose. And as they drove through the city, Sophie watched quietly, her eyes taking in buildings she had never noticed before, streets that felt both familiar and new, while Ethan sat beside her, his posture relaxed but attentive, not guarding, not interfering, just there. And Claire drove without unnecessary conversation, allowing the silence to settle into something comfortable, something that did not need to be filled. And after 20 minutes, they turned into a quiet area lined with trees and low buildings, the kind of place that felt intentional without being overwhelming. And when the car stopped, Sophie looked up at the building in front of her, simple on the outside, but carrying a quiet sense of purpose that was hard to explain. "This is it," Claire said gently, stepping out and opening the door for them. And as they walked inside, the space greeted them not with grandeur, but with warmth, soft lighting, open rooms, and the faint sound of music drifting from somewhere deeper within, not polished, not perfect, just real. And Sophie paused for a moment, listening, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, as if something inside her recognized the sound before her mind did. "You can take your time," Claire said, her voice low, respectful of the moment, and Ethan stood just behind Sophie, not pushing, not guiding, simply present, and slowly, Sophie stepped forward, drawn toward the sound, each step careful but certain, and as they entered the main room, a few children sat at different stations, some with instruments, some with notebooks, all focused in their own quiet way, no one performing, no one watching, just learning, just being, and Sophie stopped at the edge of it, her eyes wide not with fear, but with something softer, something like belonging not yet claimed but already felt, and Ethan watched her, his expression calm, but his eyes holding something deeper, because he could see it too, not the opportunity, not the program, but the shift, the moment where his daughter was no longer stepping into a room to prove something, but into a space where she might finally be allowed to grow. And Claire stood beside them, silent now, not explaining, not guiding, because she understood that some things did not need words, they needed space. And in that quiet, something settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to mark the beginning of something neither of them could fully see yet, but both could feel. No one announced her arrival. No one asked her to perform. And for the first time, Sophie was not being watched. She was simply being allowed to exist in the same space as others who were quietly building something of their own. "You can sit anywhere," Claire said softly, her voice barely rising above the gentle hum of instruments and low conversations, and Sophie glanced back at Ethan, not for permission, but for reassurance, and he gave a small nod, the kind that said more than words ever could. So she moved forward, step by step, until she reached an empty stool near a piano that was not polished to perfection but carried the marks of use, of time, of hands that had learned and tried and failed and tried again. And she sat, her fingers resting lightly on her knees at first, listening, absorbing, while across the room, a boy practiced scales slowly, deliberately, each note uneven but honest, and a girl nearby scribbled lyrics into a notebook, pausing now and then to hum softly under her breath. And there was no judgment in the room, no expectation hanging in the air, only presence. And Sophie exhaled without realizing she had been holding her breath, her shoulders lowering just slightly, as if something inside her had finally found a place to rest. "Go ahead," Ethan said quietly from behind her, not stepping closer, not drawing attention, just offering space. And Sophie lifted her hands, placing them gently on the keys, pressing one note, then another, the sound simple, unforced, and no one turned, no one stared, because here, sound was not performance, it was process. And slowly, she began to play the melody she had sung days before, softer now, more tentative, but still hers, and the room continued as it had, steady, calm, allowing her to exist within it rather than outside of it. And Claire watched from a distance, her arms loosely crossed, not interfering, not guiding, because she understood that this moment was not hers to shape, it belonged to Sophie. And Ethan stood beside her, his gaze fixed not on the room, not on the other children, but on his daughter. And there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not pride exactly, not relief, but recognition, the quiet understanding that she was stepping into something that did not require him to protect her from it, only to stand with her through it. And after a few minutes, Sophie stopped playing, not abruptly, just naturally, as if the moment had reached its end. And she turned slightly on the stool, looking back at Ethan, her eyes searching, not for approval, but for connection, and he gave her a small smile, the same one he had given her on stage, the same one that never asked for more than what she was already willing to give. "That felt different," she said softly, and Ethan nodded. "It was," he replied, and there was no need to explain why, because both of them could feel it, the absence of pressure, the presence of something real. And Claire stepped forward then, not interrupting, just joining the space. "This is where it begins," she said gently, her voice carrying that same calm certainty. "Not with applause, not with expectations, but with moments like this." And Sophie looked around the room again, this time not as an outsider, but as someone beginning to understand where she might belong. And for a brief second, everything grew still, not because something dramatic had happened, but because something quiet had taken root, something that did not demand attention, but would, in time, change everything. That followed the room did not change its rhythm for her. And that was what made it different. No spotlight followed her, no one announced her progress. And yet something within Sophie began to shift in a way that felt stronger than applause. "You can come back next week," Claire said gently, not as an invitation filled with pressure, but as a door left open. And Sophie looked at Ethan again, her eyes quieter now, less uncertain. "Can we?" she asked, and Ethan did not hesitate this time. "We can," he answered, his voice steady, because he could see what this place was doing, not shaping her into something else, but allowing her to become more of who she already was. And as they prepared to leave, one of the instructors approached, not in a rush, not with a clipboard or expectations, just with a calm presence. "She listens before she plays," he said, softly, nodding towards Sophie. "That matters." Ethan gave a small nod in return, not seeking praise, just acknowledging the truth in the observation, while Sophie stood quietly beside him, absorbing every word without letting it define her. And outside, the air felt different than when they had arrived, not brighter, not louder, but clearer, like something inside them had aligned just enough to make the path ahead feel less uncertain. "Did I do okay?" Sophie asked as they reached the car, her voice careful, not fishing for reassurance, just asking honestly, and Ethan crouched slightly, meeting her at eye level again. "You showed up," he said. "That is more than okay." And Sophie smiled faintly, the kind of smile that did not need to be big to be real, and as they drove back through the city, the silence between them felt full rather than empty, each of them carrying something they had not had before, and Claire watched them in the rearview mirror, not intruding, not guiding, just observing the quiet bond that had made all of this possible. And when they arrived back at the apartment, she stepped out, but did not follow them inside this time. "Next Saturday," she said simply, and Ethan nodded. "We will be there." And there was no need for anything more, no formal agreement, no signatures, just a continuation of something that had already begun. And as the car pulled away, Sophie stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than usual, looking not at where she had been, but at where she might be going, and Ethan stood beside her, his presence unchanged, steady as ever, but something in him had shifted too, not in a way that sought recognition, but in a way that understood that. Sometimes, the smallest decisions carried the quietest kind of power, and inside the apartment, the keyboard waited where it always had. But when Sophie sat down this time, her hands did not hesitate, her fingers finding the keys with a familiarity that had grown in just a few hours. And as the first notes filled the room, Ethan paused in the doorway, listening, not as a judge, not as a teacher, but as a father who understood that this sound, simple and imperfect, was the beginning of something that did not need to be rushed, did not need to be proven, only lived. And somewhere across the city, Claire Bennett stood in her office once again, the file still open on her desk, but now with more than a name written inside it. Now it held a story she had chosen to follow, not because it was extraordinary to the world, but because it was real, and as she closed the file gently, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." And for once, she was not thinking about outcomes, she was thinking about what happens when quiet dignity is finally given the space to be seen weeks past without announcement, without dramatic change, but everything beneath the surface began to grow, quietly, steadily, like roots finding their way through unseen ground. And every Saturday at 10 o'clock, the same car would arrive, the same door would open, and Sophie would step into a space that no longer felt unfamiliar, but not yet fully hers. And each time, she listened first, just as the instructor had noticed, absorbing the room before adding her own voice to it. Her playing still imperfect, still searching, but no longer hesitant, and Ethan always remained just a few steps behind, never in the center, never drawing attention, but always there, his presence as constant as the rhythm she was beginning to find. And people began to notice, not loudly, not all at once, but in the quiet ways that matter more, a nod from an instructor, a longer pause from another student listening, a subtle shift in how space made room for her instead of around her. "You are finding your tone," Claire said one afternoon, standing beside her as Sophie practiced a simple progression, and Sophie glanced up, unsure. "What does that mean?" she asked, and Claire smiled faintly. "It means you are no longer trying to sound like anyone else," she replied, and that stayed with Sophie longer than any technical advice could have, because it was not about correction, it was about permission. And back at school, the change followed her in quieter ways, fewer whispers, fewer looks that tried to define her before she could speak. And when someone did ask, "Are you still doing that music thing?" she no longer shrank or explained. She simply nodded. "Yeah." And that was enough, because the need to justify had slowly disappeared, and Ethan watched all of this not as a spectator, but as someone who understood what it meant for a person to grow without losing themselves. And one evening, as Sophie played at the small keyboard in their apartment, the notes fuller now, more connected, he stood in the doorway again, listening the way he always had. But this time, there was something else in his expression. Not just recognition, but relief, the kind that comes when you realize the path ahead is no longer defined by fear. And across town, Claire reviewed reports, schedules, commitments, but her attention returned again and again to one simple observation, that what she had built was not meant to create stars, it was meant to protect something more fragile, something more valuable, and Sophie had reminded her why that mattered. And so she made a quiet decision, one that did not require approval, one that did not need to be announced. She cleared space in the upcoming showcase, not as a test, not as a performance to prove worth, but as an opportunity to stand in a room again, not to be judged, but to be heard. And when she called Ethan later that evening, her voice carried the same calm steadiness it always had. "There is an event coming up," she said. Small, respectful, nothing like what she faced before, and Ethan listened, his silence thoughtful, measured. "Only if she wants to," he replied, and Claire nodded, even though he could not see it. "Only if she wants to," she echoed, and when Sophie was told, she did not answer right away. She looked down at her hands, at the keys in front of her, at the space she had grown into. And then she looked up at her father, not asking, not afraid, just present. "I think I am ready," she said quietly, and the words did not fill the room with excitement. They settled into it, calm, certain, and in that moment, the silence that followed was not hesitation, it was strength, the kind that does not need to be seen to be real. The room was quieter than the first time, not because fewer people were there, but because this time, no one had come to judge, no one had come to laugh. And when Sophie stepped onto the small stage, there were no whispers waiting for her, only a gentle stillness that felt earned. "Take your time," Claire said softly from the side, not directing, not guiding, just reminding. And Sophie nodded once, her fingers resting lightly on the piano keys, her breathing steady, not because she was fearless, but because she understood something now that she had not before. That fear did not have to disappear for courage to exist. And in the audience, Ethan stood near the back, not in the front row, not in the center, just where he had always been, present but unseen, his arms relaxed at his sides, his eyes steady on his daughter, and the lights above were softer this time, not blinding, not harsh, just enough to hold the moment without overwhelming it. And for a second, everything paused. The kind of pause that does not demand attention but gathers it naturally. And then Sophie began, not rushing, not proving, just playing. The melody simple at first, then deeper, fuller, each note carrying something she had found along the way, something that belonged only to her. And no one interrupted, no one shifted. The room leaned into the sound without realizing it. And as the music filled the space, it was not loud, not dramatic, but it was honest. And honesty has a way of quieting everything else. And Ethan watched, not smiling, not reacting outwardly, but something in his eyes softened, because he could see it clearly now, not the performance, not the opportunity, but the person she was becoming. And when the final note faded, there was no immediate applause, just a breath, a shared stillness that lasted a moment longer than expected, as if the room itself needed time to understand what it had just heard. And then slowly, gently, people began to clap, not with excitement, not with spectacle, but with respect, the kind that does not shout, the kind that stays. And Sophie lifted her hands from the keys, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes not searching the crowd this time, but finding her father. And Ethan gave her that same small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement that had carried her from the very beginning. And it was enough. It had always been enough. And Claire stood nearby, watching not with satisfaction, but with understanding, because she knew this moment was not about success. It was about truth being seen without needing to explain itself. And as Sophie stepped down from the stage, there was no rush to surround her, no overwhelming praise, just space, the same kind of space that had allowed her to grow. And Ethan met her halfway, not lifting her up, not making a scene, just standing there, steady. "That felt right," Sophie said softly, and Ethan nodded. "It was," he replied, and nothing more needed to be said, because some things, once they are real, do not need to be repeated. And as they walked out together, the night air greeted them with the same quiet calm it always had, but everything inside them had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to carry forward, enough to remind them that dignity does not demand to be heard, it simply exists. And when it finally meets the right moment, the world does not react with noise, it responds with silence.